social change is made up of many, many, many little happenings. These happenings change the way that people think about an issue. You don't immediately get to the law, actually. It's that the idea has to be kind of bubbling up and then eventually turns into some kind of law or policy or program. So, really, we all have the power to do something. We just have to do it and then see how it works and do something else and see how that works. All of these little changes start to combine and make a wave or a movement that provokes some kind of lasting change.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Those meant to benefit from social justice reforms are routinely left out of the design process entirely. As a result, designs miss the mark, and designers lose an opportunity to grow agency in a community. After witnessing power struggles between the oppressed and their surroundings, design practitioner Dr. Lesley-Ann Noel learned that co-design from within a system is the most powerful way to create productive and equitable outcomes. But that's a lot easier to say than to do. Lesley-Ann is an author, a university professor at North Carolina State University, and a design practitioner specializing in equity, social justice, and marginalized groups in design research. She has a background in industrial design, an MBA from the University of West Indies, and a PhD in design from North Carolina State University. In this episode, Lesley-Ann and I talk about what the design of work can learn from her recent book, Designing Social Change, the importance of co-design with those most affected by the system, 3 critical levels of awareness for a designer, different sources of power within an identity, and the importance of recognizing your own positionality as a designer. We also discuss the duality of the oppressed and the oppressor, and the essential strategies for enacting change. All right, to continue supporting Work for Humans, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I bring you my conversation with Lesley-Ann Noel. Lesley-Ann Noel, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you so much, Dad.
I've just spent a lot of time absorbing your book, Design for Social Change. I think it's doing something really important. The idea of innovation is this sort of idea that you can leap to something, like from zero to innovation. It's like saying you're in New York and we want you now to be in Paris, but we don't tell you anything about how to swim. And it was when design thinking came along that all of a sudden there was a method for getting to innovation. And I feel very much the same way about some of the very big ideas related to social justice and social change, which is we want to be there, but we're not given a method to get there. And I think that the way you've combined design and social change together starts to do that.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for telling me that. Sometimes I wonder if the title of the book is too grand, Design Social Change, but I do think, designers are optimists. So I think that if we can dream it, we could try to figure out how to get there. And so one of the things I'm challenging people to do is to dream of the change that they want, and then let's figure out how to get there. Of course, I'm telling people a lot more than that, but that's one of the ideas.
Yeah. I can see this book as being read 2 ways. I can see it as a book for designers and saying to designers, don't forget the components of social change in your designs. Or I can see it for people who are in the social change activities and saying to them, you can incorporate design concepts and design tools into social change. Do you see it as both or more one or the other?
I see it as both and, because I was actually thinking of the person who felt powerless. So that person might not even feel that they are a designer or a social justice mover. It's the person who needs the change And so most of the point of view in the book is that, where I'm trying to tell people, okay, try to identify the change around you that is needed. Try to figure out who is the group that is going to move with you, and then try to design. So one point of view is that. There is a point of view where I'm thinking of people being able to see where change is needed for other people, right? And being able to empathize with them and then maybe join them along the way, right? So the work is very Freirean. I mentioned Paulo Freire a few times in the book. Freire's big idea is that we build this critical awareness of the world, and then that gives us the consciousness that the world doesn't just happen to us and we act on it. And I think that that's a very strong design message. So I was really trying to build on that kind of message and say, well, okay, yes, as designers, we act on this world. And so let's then imagine the worlds that we want and let's build them, and then there are all these recipes to get people there.
Can you just describe for the audience the 3 levels of awareness that Freire describes?
So there are 3 levels of consciousness. There is naive consciousness, where you're not really questioning the world around you. There is magical consciousness, where you are kind of saying that what happens in the world happens because of magic, right? And a lot of us do that. We say, oh, it was fate, it was this, the universes collided or whatever. And that is a bit of magical consciousness. And critical consciousness is when we are really aware of the world, and then we see the world for what it is, but we know that it's not fixed. And we can take action.
I'll tell you, I had a very interesting interview recently with Jerry Toner. He's a classicist at Cambridge, and he studied Roman slavery. And one of the things that the Romans said was, get your slaves to believe in your gods. Because if they believe that your gods are the reason that you are in power, then they will believe that they deserve to be slaves.
Yes. What I'm saying in the book is the opposite of that, because
I
I'm
agree.
saying, yes, definitely. I am saying, see the world for what it is, and then understand that you have power to work against that.
And his second one, magical, it sounds like the Romans were selling.
Yes.
Which is, it is your destiny. And in fact, in your book, you mention that this is a belief system that says you accept injustices because it's the way of the world and your destiny. And so you're very right, which is that you're saying to people that they can achieve critical consciousness and use design to improve it.
Yes. Designers have a superpower. Maybe the sociologists will analyze society, and all of these other people will analyze, but as designers, if we combine that analytical outlook with the way that we make things as designers, I think that that's something really powerful. So I guess if you go back to the original thing, am I talking to designers? Yes. On one level, I can be talking to designers and saying, hey, look at the world more critically. Or it could be that I'm talking to the other people who normally analyze the world critically, but maybe they stop short of the building and prototyping, which we do as designers. And I'll say, okay, yeah, do that analysis that you all do, and then let's build something. So maybe combining worlds.
Can you describe, it's something that I don't think is in the book, but it was just slightly mentioned, that you worked with students in Tobago and you helped them to go through, I think it's a design process. The reason I want to start there is partially because then we'll have this nice concrete example where we can go back and we can attach some of the big theoretical ideas that are in the book to that.
But this book actually, we could say, started with that work that I did with children in Trinidad and Tobago, maybe about 6 years ago. First, we talked about rights. There's a type of education called rights-based education. So I was thinking, can we make rights-based design education? And so we talked about what are the things that are good enough in the world? What do we have right to? And then we moved into kind of critiquing the world around us. And then the children critiqued their school and their village. And that was a really interesting process, to hear children say, well, I don't like the mango trees in the yard at school, right? I'm like, okay, what could be the problem with the mango trees? And so, well, the mangoes are fantastic, but we can't pick them, right? And so there were a whole lot of designs that the children made afterwards, because that was the next step after they critiqued the world. They had to design something to address the issue that they found. And maybe about 5 or 6 children designed mango pickers so that they could have easier access to these mangoes that were causing them so much distress. Another child said, I like going to church, but I don't want to wake up early in the morning and I don't want to leave my house. And this child then drew a Skype church. And I thought, wow, because when the pandemic actually came, I was like, oh my gosh, this child foresaw the future, right? Because they drew and put in all the features that they really loved about the fellowship of church. But they just said, I'm not leaving my home, so I'm going to do this thing remotely. And so it was a really great experience for a couple of reasons. It was nice to be able to understand from the children's point of view what was wrong with the world. And I don't think anyone had ever asked them anything like that. The principal was very surprised to hear that even the mango trees were a problem, right? And then it was exciting. I can't think of whatever other word to use, but it was so thrilling to see the designs that the children were coming up with to solve the issues in the world around them. And, okay, so those stories I talk about a lot, but there were other things, when I say those stories, I mean the mango pickers and the Skype church. But there are other things that they came up with. Like one child said that there wasn't enough economic activity in the village. I mean, I don't expect a 10-year-old to tell me that. And they said, well, we're going to make a bus that's going to bring people. So it's like a tour and a party bus to bring people into our village, to make our village the center of attention. And then they can go after, so we had just really, really deep conversations about that. But that actually is the start of a lot of the work in this book, where we have to understand the world. So we critique the world, we see what the issues are in the world. Then the next phase is we have to imagine something better. We imagine a better state, and then we can figure out what are the things, the programs, the projects, what are the things that we need to get to that better state.
There's a couple of really central things in there. The first one is co-design and who's doing the designing. In this case, kids who are inside the system, who are being affected by the system. You're creating an awareness of a couple of things. One is that maybe the world is not the shape that they want it to be. And two, that it might be possible to think of something different. But you made a number of points where you said how important it is that those who are affected by the system be involved in the designs.
Yes, definitely. I think that it is difficult to understand what other people face. We as designers talk about empathy a lot, but empathy is a really complicated sensation or feeling, and there's a limit to how much we can empathize with other people. And therefore, co-design really is important, because either the people who are impacted are designing among themselves, or they're designing with other people who are not impacted. But, then we can go beyond the limits of where we can reach with empathy, because even if we are trying to empathize with other people, there are limits. We can't crawl into their heads and understand. We'll be wrong and we'll be off. But if they are part of the process, if there is a diverse group of people who are facing many different oppressions as part of the process, then we'll get much deeper in the design work that we're trying to do.
So on the one hand, we don't even need empathy anymore. I don't mean that the way it sounded. We don't have to rely on our own empathy anymore by involving those who are affected in the design. My experience is that there are many people who are affected, they're really kind of bought into it. I don't deserve the mangoes, or something like that. But there's a second thing there, which is it may be that those who can describe the issue are not in a position to change it. And I think about this with product design, which is I can tell somebody all day long what I want from a smartphone, but I can't build a smartphone. I can't design a smartphone. And with social change, you might have the same issue, which is that I'm not in a position of power to make those changes. Is that a concern? That it's hard to follow through?
That is a major concern. I think sometimes we have more power than we think we have, though. And I will come into this conversation saying, as a designer, I will tend to be more optimistic than somebody else because, and then people have written about this, designers are optimistic, right? We believe that there is a solution and that makes us follow through. That's the only thing that keeps us going in the chaos, that we know we can get to the solution. But yes, sometimes we don't have power, but our power might come in other ways. So the first thing that I'm asking people to do is actually think about themselves and their identity and, the complexity of their identity. They might find some power in different facets of their identity. There is a section in the book where I'm asking people to work with others. So some of your power might come from, not just in the co-design session, but there's also just that power of knowing that you're not alone, right? And so that you can get other people to move with you along a movement, right? And then actually my favorite section in the book is about oppositional gaze or anger, and just like maybe even being powerful just through your silence or your quiet or the way that you're staring at people. So, sometimes your power to make change might be only because you made somebody have to think about an issue, right? Whereas before they couldn't even think about it. The issue wasn't on their agenda, but you brought this issue to the surface just by being there. So we have power in different ways. And then another thing that I like to say in my class, actually, I don't even remember if it's in the book or not, is that change happens over time. And the change that you think is important might start off as this tiny fringe movement, but eventually these movements just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So maybe then one of the messages is that we need you to see where the change is needed, because some of us might not be able to see it. But once you see it, bring it up to the surface and then let's turn that into a movement, because it's a continuous path. After we address one issue, we're going to move on to another one and another one and another one. And so we need people to be surfacing what needs to change. And that's one of the things I'm asking people to do in this book.
You passed very quickly by about 4 different really big ideas, and I want to go into each one of them. One of them is the importance of designers recognizing their own positionality. And it's one of the first things you say in the book is that if you're going to be a designer, you need to understand your positionality. Can you explain that?
I'll say I am an industrial designer by training, but I trained in industrial design like, let's say, 25 years ago. But when I did industrial design, nobody ever taught me to see myself in the process. And I'll say that I did not really see the impact of positionality until I changed country a few times. And then, with every time you move into a new culture, you can see more clearly what is kind of invisible around you. I think that we don't understand as designers why we might make some of the choices that we make. We might think a choice is neutral when actually the choice is not. I'll give you an example of that. So I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, as I mentioned. And because red is our national color, it might mean that as I look around downtown Port of Spain, there'll just be many, many more people wearing red than in Curitiba, Brazil, where I used to live before, right? Where the national colors are green and yellow. And people don't understand. So when I'm a designer in Trinidad, I might choose red as a color, but it's in part also related to my positionality as a Trinidadian. And then someone else might say red is absolutely not a color that we're going to use. So that's a kind of basic example. But the thing is, we don't see when our identities might be impacting the design choices that we make for other people. And that's really why I ask people always to stop, think about who you are, think about the identities of the people that you're working with, and then you could try to see actually if you are going to maybe even get some richness from the combination of identities, or is it that everybody's kind of the same and therefore we'll have a blind spot? I'm not even telling people to make a decision. It's just to see what you cannot normally see, right? So now I go into a room and I see myself. I know, okay, I am a Black woman. I'm from the Caribbean. There are things that maybe people can't see, but I know. I speak Portuguese, or, and all of these things might affect my design choices in a particular way.
I think that's a good segue into the idea of a pluriverse. Can you describe that concept? It's a little bit different from positionality, but it's very close to what I think you were talking about when you were talking about ways of seeing that are culturally based.
Yes, so the idea of the pluriverse is that it's a world of many worlds, or a world where many worlds fit. So, very often when we're talking about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, actually that last word being the issue, we're talking about including and then maybe kind of melting, that melting pot idea. We're trying to get everybody to work together, to melt together, meld together, right? But the idea of the pluriverse is that, oh, there are these many distinct worlds that people are living in, maybe at the same time. And it really then is about us seeing that diversity and kind of understanding, oh, actually, there are many different ways of seeing, of knowing, of doing, of believing. And we have to be conscious of that. So we can't go into any situation assuming that we all think the same way, because we know that there are all of these diverse perspectives. And we want to bring in these diverse perspectives as we work. So actually, it is about life being much more complex. It's about complexity rather than simplicity, and it's about not about flattening, it's about kind of raising issues up. A pluriversal world is actually difficult to work in because it's complex. We have to slow down a little bit more if we're thinking with that pluriversal mindset, but then we are much more aware of the variety of practices that people have in the world.
Yeah, the way I have struggled to think about this idea is not that people are different from each other, but that people are living in different worlds. That's the way I think about it. And normally, as a designer, you think, well, this person's different from this person. But this is actually this is deeper and more thorough.
Yes, there are these different worlds, and these worlds are happening at the same time. One way I think about it is that maybe I need to learn a different language to move into another world, and have conversation in that other world. Or maybe I need to learn some kind of, translation skills. But I have to understand people live in their world and I live in my world, and I can't impose then my worldview on them. Now, I can share my worldview and I can be curious about their worldview. But and that way that I just use is probably pretty important, that curiosity, because very often people are trying to change the way people think. But if you have that awareness that actually there are these many different ways of being and knowing and whatnot, maybe then the languages can be a little, the way we talk about it can be a little different, where we are then going to go in with a little bit more curiosity about the world that these people live in. And then we can decide what are the conversations we want to have between worlds. We're not trying to conquer their world, hopefully. We are trying to figure out how we can be maybe a little bit more diplomatic and have conversations across worlds.
I think it's a very powerful idea. And it goes very well with what you were saying before, which is that I could design something from outside of somebody's world and I'm never going to get it. But if I can co create with people in a world from within that world and listen to their designs. So essentially, you're pushing more of the processing, more of the design activity into the world in which it needs to exist.
Yes, yes. And actually, you pushed me mentally into the space of like a UN or something like that. So, okay, maybe the people, the leaders, the representatives from the different worlds have to come together and talk.
Mm.
And that's how we design something.
Let's stick for a while with the position of the designer and the emotions of the designer. It took me a while to come to grips with something you said, which is that anger is a design tool.
Yes.
Which I've never thought of before, but after thinking about it for a while, I understand it. So tell me, I think I understand it, why that is.
It is that all the emotions we could get people to talk about are information that we need as designers. So if someone says that they are afraid, they are happy, they are angry, if they use a word that's more complicated, like I'm exasperated, we need that emotion to understand again where the change maybe is needed, or and it might not be always a negative signal, right? Because sometimes the emotions can be a positive signal, but it's that the emotion tells us a little bit more than we can get regularly, right? And why I focused on anger is because anger is one emotion that we try to suppress often. And I noticed that when I would hear stories about people protesting or people being very angry, in Trinidad, for example, people burn tires in the streets when they're angry. And I noticed that a lot of people, like maybe people who couldn't see the need for change, would start to say, why are those people so angry? They're causing problems and causing traffic. So people would focus on the anger and not the reason for the anger, and then nothing would change. So, because if you are in the social change space, the social innovation space, you have to learn to read people, even though they might not be saying things clearly in the way you want to hear it. Because we're in that space, I started to see, well, okay, that anger means something. And that anger is actually telling us very clearly about what it is people are asking for. And so, because anger is not always a socially acceptable emotion, we try to quiet it down. I want to encourage designers to see it very clearly and note it and note what is the thing that's causing the anger. Because if we address that thing, then we'll figure out where people need to change. But we're always telling people things like, oh, maybe you shouldn't be protesting, or why are you so angry, or calm down, but actually, this is information that we need to be able to design better.
And if I'm somebody inside the system and I'm feeling anger, the benefit of anger, it seems to me, is that it's agentic. It's an emotion that we feel because we want to act. It's like an emotion of action as opposed to grief or hopelessness or so many other emotions that we can feel.
Yes, I was, in fact, very, very, very angry at one stage in my teaching career. And this other professor pulled me aside and he said, I can see your anger. Turn it into something. And that was the best advice that I ever got, because my anger, like you just said, anger is agentic. So my anger gave me that fuel so that I could act. It made it very clear to me what needed to be changed, what was missing from certain conversations. It's really a good thing for us to not just stay in that stew of anger, but really push that forward as designers and move it to the next step.
And you mentioned, you have a beautiful thing in there, which is the emotion wheel.
Yes.
And just to say what it is, it's a wheel that shows all the diversity of emotions that can be. And it's a tool for designers to listen more closely to the emotional content of a person, I'm going to say, living in a system. And I say system, it easily could have been not a system. It easily could have been how I feel about this mug that I'm holding as a designer. But because this is a book about social change, it's about the system.
Yes. And that wheel, I was introduced to that wheel by some colleagues who were doing DEI training in New Orleans, where I lived. And then I did some more digging and I found out that the wheel was designed by the original wheel was designed by a psychologist in Florida. And it really is then about learning to process emotions and learning to kind of simplify some of the words that people use and to get to like 6 core emotions. And then that tells us something that we can act on, right? The version that's in the book was drawn by Abby Van Mugen, who's this fantastic designer artist I believe, in California. But it's really important for us to be able to process information. And when I first saw the wheel, I found it was so good for the relationships around me, right? So we're not even talking about big systems and big change, but even some of the work relationships, because someone might say something like, I'm frustrated. Frustrated is connected to something. It might be anger, it might be sadness. But again, if we want to change systems, so we're talking about work and designing work. If my work colleague says they're frustrated, I now, as a designer, have to think, okay, this negative emotion is telling me something, and how can we change this? Whereas my colleague might not tell me so clearly, I want to change X, but that emotion gives us some insight into where some change is needed.
I want to describe the wheel a little bit for people listening. It's complicated. The center is not that complicated, but it gets more and more broken up as it goes out. And I'll just give an example. Right at the center, there's fear, disgust, joy, genius, anger, and sad. And then just to show one of the breakdowns of one of them, fear is broken down into insignificant, busy, unsafe, disoriented, stressed, worried, insecure, and vulnerable. And so I recommend it. It's referred to here as the feeling wheel or the emotion wheel for designers. So now I want to get into the idea of when I swing the hammer of this design, what am I hitting? I ask this of designers a lot. I say, okay, I'm a designer. Now I'm making something. What am I hitting with the hammer to make this thing a reality? Like, what's the material of social change?
I will sound vague when I say this. It can be so many things. After I wrote this book, we went through a year of editing and I read it over a few times and I thought, oh, wow, now I need 2 or 3 more books to continue the process because this is the start of it. But what is your hammer hitting? What are you making? What you are making actually depends on your positionality at the start, right? It depends on who you are. So, what you are making, if you are, for example, a lawyer, you might be making policies, right? If you are a city official, you might be making programs. If you are a graphic designer, you might be making posters or t shirts. We will all make different things. If you're an ordinary citizen, you might be making a letter to the editor. And the idea, though, is to get into action, to do something, and then find some other people who you can kind of move along the path with you. And everybody's going to be doing something. Maybe you're making a sign and putting it in front of your house. Like, those neighborhoods where all of the houses have different signs. Even that becomes part of a movement. But it's that all of these little changes start to combine and make a wave or a movement that provokes some kind of lasting change.
That is so empowering, I think, because it says that the thing that you are making is in reach, because it's the thing you may already be. And since what makes up sort of social situations is made of lots of things, it's very likely that the thing that is right in front of you is an opportunity.
Well, I like how you said it, but that is in fact the idea that social change is made up of many, many, many little happenings. These happenings change the way that people think about an issue. And we can think about something like somebody did something to change the way people felt about slavery. And I have one story in the book, or one reference in the book that I got from a lawyer, where this lawyer told me about artists who made paintings and wrote poetry against slavery. I had no idea, right? And he said, but that's how you change the way people think. You don't immediately get to the law, actually. It's that the idea has to be kind of bubbling up and then eventually turns into some kind of law or policy or program. Or so really, we all have the power to do something. And the thing is, there's that little section about prototyping where we just have to do it
Mm-hmm.
and then see how it works and do something else and see how that works. So it's not a big design book. It's maybe I don't want to say a small design book, but it is about people designing many little actions.
It is a big design book for individuals. That's the way I see it. Because the concepts, and we're never going to be able to touch all of the big ideas that are in this book, but the concepts that you introduce in the book are enormous, but they're personalized. This is what they mean for you as a designer, potentially a designer inside the system that needs to be changed. And so this brings me to the topic of this podcast. And I found this so far very affirming because what we're looking at a lot is, why is work? Somebody introduced me to this term recently. They said, work is gray.
Oh boy.
They said the grayness of work. And so the premise of this show is that work is a product that we are selling to a customer who is employees. And the reason for that framing is that lots of reasons for the framing, but one of the reasons is it brings to bear all the tools of design to making that product better. But then the question is, when you swing the hammer to make work better, what do you hit? Well, what we talk a lot about on the show is you're hitting business models, because business models need to change if we're going to recognize employees as a customer. Because today, employees are framed as inputs to production, essentially as things. And when we swing the hammer, we need to change structures of power, which multi-sided businesses give a lot of power to both sides. They have to in a business model, because a business that has two customers has to have very empowered organizations to support both customers. And then the question is how do you go after that? Well, you build processes that embody the new structures, and you form communities to spread them. So it's very consistent.
I hear some overlaps, because we're talking about like communities and empowering, and yes, definitely, definitely.
Well, so one of the phrases you use is oppositional gaze, and as a tool in the designer's toolbox. What is that?
That is in the section near to the anger, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking about emotional intelligence. And that's the second big idea of the book. So the first big idea, the first section is about building the critical awareness and understanding the world. And the second section is about building that emotional awareness and kind of maybe even understanding your emotional power. So that oppositional gaze is about looking at people angrily. So the person who is powerless, for example, might just be able to express their anger just through their eyes, right? Or just being maybe a little confrontational in the space, like you are talking about work. Maybe I'm insignificant in my work, but by being there, being in a meeting where I can't speak, by being there, I can still take up space and I can look at people oppositionally. I don't have to even say anything, but through my eyes and my gaze, I'm able to tell them that whatever it is that they're proposing, that idea they want to bring, that something needs to change in what they're doing. So that's the idea of the oppositional gaze, that you still have power just even by being there.
I want to say what the definition of social justice is, because I think it's a really important statement. Social justice seeks equity in the distribution of wealth, opportunity, and privileges. And one of my questions is whether there are situations that are bad that harm everybody equally and might fall into the social justice lens. And the reason I say that is that work in particular, the way it's delivered today, doesn't harm everybody equally, but it does harm everybody. And so, for example, the CEO of the company may hate their work. And so the issue is global distribution of harm. It might be that by starting with those who are most harmed, that you can learn a lot that helps everyone. One of the core moral issues of the way work is done today is that it treats people like things. But some parts of the workforce are treated much more like things than other parts of the workforce.
So some people are more valuable things and some people are less valuable things.
And people who are close to you become people. But people who are far from you in the work system become things. And so, for instance, in my town, the Spanish-speaking population this is a crazy liberal town, right? But the Spanish-speaking population is completely separate and is doing a completely different kind of work and is much more, I'm going to say, thingified as opposed to objectified, because I think objectified is used so much we don't even know what it means anymore, but put into the position of being a thing than others. So I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm just throwing out a bunch of open questions that are related to your work.
That's a very interesting angle that you're taking, because oppression is when people are being pressed down. And then where you're going is that actually everybody is being pressed down in the workplace, even if they are doing the highly valued work or the lower valued work. It is really just the whole system is created to not support people. And I feel that. I definitely feel that. I don't know. I think that you have a big challenge trying to figure out how to design a better workplace, or encouraging people to think about designing a better workplace. But I think there are, in fact, some strategies maybe that people with more power in the workplace could be employing to make people feel like they are more of a part of something, or that they have more agency. How aware are the people with power of, if we come back to that whole question of oppression, how aware are they of the oppressions in the workplace in the first place, right? So I teach, and I'll give like a tiny example from my privileged place as an instructor. I remember asking someone if I could change the time of a class. I think the class was at 6 o'clock. And I said something like, okay, my son's, it was something about pick up at school. And they said to me, absolutely not. We can't change the time of this class. And they weren't able to see then the way that tiny interaction was actually pushing me down, right? And so, like in a workplace, people have to learn to see that, the fact that you are preventing parents from not being able to leave when their children have to be picked up is a form of you contributing to their oppression. Or, the way that we define oppression might change, but it's that can you even see these things to then be able to address them? Are you going to create that space?
Yeah. One of the very earliest interviews I did was with an experienced modeler named Alder Yarrow. And he said something really interesting is that your experience is not of a static world around you. Instead, it's you sending out a signal and getting an echo back. You send out a signal and you're basically constructing a world model based upon echolocation. And so you send out a signal and it said, could we change this? And the signal was, no, you do not have agency in this space. You do not have control of this space. That's one thing that reminds me is this idea that we're always sending out signals to the system and learning from how it responds to us.
Yes, yes. And actually, you said I had no agency. I was a thing. I was the thing teaching class. So I had no agency. I had absolutely, I was not a person at that point. I couldn't say, oh, well, my child is in school, anything. No, I wasn't human.
I've said this a lot on the show, but one of the things that we do to improve this is that we flip the org chart so that the managers at the bottom and the people who work in that organization are at the top. It's a subtle thing, but it changes the metaphor from one of control and a lack of agency to one of agency.
Similarly to you, I have been starting to ask, how can academic leadership really serve students? If I'm interviewing, for example, a new dean, or, my question isn't about how you're going to serve faculty. My thing is, what are you actually going to do to make the students thrive? Or even the lowest level staff, like you flipping the org chart. I've started to find that, yes, the feedback, because we're talking about echolocation, the signal is stronger when I ask that question, actually, because they have to think more deeply.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I'll tell you, there once was a university
Oh, boy.
that did this very well, and it was New College of Florida. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of how they functioned. One, before the school year started, they sent out to all the students essentially a questionnaire saying, what would you like to study this year? And then they built the course catalog out of the student demand. And then the faculty had the summer to think about how they were going to design a curriculum that would satisfy that demand.
I think that that's really important. And actually, I don't do exactly that, but I do because I really believe in critical pedagogy and critical literacy. I do something towards the end of my semester where I ask students to kind of suggest the topics for the next semester, right? So they don't get to influence the semester that they experienced, but they do get to influence the following semester.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a very powerful thing to do.
It means I'm always working.
Well, I mean, that's right. I think it meant a lot of work for the faculty. And then another way that they taught, which I really admired, is that 4 days before class, you needed to have read the materials for that particular class. And then you would say, what are 3 things I learned? What are 3 things I don't understand? What are 3 insights I had? You'd submit that, and then the faculty member would design the next class 4 days later around the input and was always in this listening mode. And of course, this is the college that the governor of Florida decided to do his best to destroy.
Yeah. But that school was, I'm sure, designed by people who believed in critical pedagogy and believed in even Paulo Freire, because those are the same principles, where kind of like we make this world together. And
Mm-hmm.
so we make the content of the class together. I react to you. So, Paulo Freire talks about the banking model of education, which is what most of us experience, where maybe some teacher is trying to put knowledge into our heads. But the opposite to that is this kind of critical education where we are always in conversation with each other. So, where the students are in conversation with the professors and saying, well, this is the content. So that's what I'm trying to bring into my classroom when I ask students to design the next class. I want to learn from them.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it means I'm always working, but I'm always learning. It's not that they learn from me, it's that we are learning together. And, I think that could be like a really, really useful construct or way of working in the workplace where people will feel less thingified, where, they have much more influence on this world around them. They can give feedback and send signals as well to the organization, which would be really important.
I'm so pleased that I coined the term thingified and we're using it in a
Yeah, I
meaningful
think that's
today.
a wonderful.
Really, today, it was like, because I didn't want to use the word objectified because I think it's been used so much that we don't know what it means anymore. But that makes me happy. I was asked recently in the work that I'm doing, who's the villain? It's kind of a question that I had reading your book, which is, does oppression require an oppressor? And the reason I bring it up is that I don't love the idea of making anyone the villain in the story, because I suspect if I got completely into somebody's universe, that I would find out that they were not the villain in their story.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second reason I don't love the idea of identifying a villain is that I worry that the system might have an affective filter that goes up. This is something my wife talks about, who's a teacher, is that if you don't do teaching just right with especially young kids, that an affective filter goes up and they can't hear you anymore because they've gotten emotional about something. They're no longer learning. And I wonder if the system also can put up an affective filter, or if the people who you call a villain are going to no longer be able to hear you. That's a lot of questions.
Well, the thing is, we are all oppressor and oppressed at some time. So the story doesn't have one villain. Maybe there are many villains and there are many victims. And so that thing of learning to see the world is for us to see when people are victims and maybe when people are villains, including us, because we also push people down. So, that first thing of that critical awareness of the world means that when I understand my positionality, when I understand this world around me, I can start seeing, if we go back to that thing of that example of class at a time that I couldn't, if I am the person who is making the schedule, I'll see when I'm the oppressor because I am preventing that parent from being a good parent, right? And I will see when I am the oppressed, when I don't hear very well. So, like when I'm in a room that has bad acoustics, then maybe I'm the oppressed. I mean, those are kind of very small examples, but it is that we're always changing roles. And it's an oversimplification to think that someone is going to be always the oppressor and then the other person is going to be always the oppressed.
Okay. I admire that response, and I like that response. I think the person who's asking me this question about villainy is partially because he thinks it tells a better story, and that if you want to create change, naming a villain is very motivating, but I think it's more harmful than good.
And complexity tells a good story. So it's good for us to think about the complexity of a situation as well, And I mean, if we want to think about stories, think about these movie people like the bad guy in the Black Panther, Killmonger, wasn't quite a bad guy, or that the villain is often more complex than we think. And it is important for us to see that complexity. So even that comes back to that question about pluriversality and, which you talked about at the start. Maybe the villain is not a villain in their world. But, if we can look through and we can just recognize the moments when that person is oppressing, and we might be the people who are oppressing, and the moments when people are oppressed. And if we can focus on those things without maybe necessarily naming people as good guys and bad guys, because actually we're always moving between these different roles.
Yeah. This is the other big framing of the book, is that it's framed around the idea of cooking. That the way to look at design is, one way to look at it is through a cooking lens, and the ingredients that you're going to add to this meal to make it come out. How did you arrive at that analogy?
So I had been working with that analogy for a few years. I believe we started off talking about design thinking at the top of the show. And I think that people who are trained in design very often have a strong reaction to design thinking, with the steps. And this kind of cooking analogy was one way for me as a designer to rationalize the method of design thinking that people talk about. Because sometimes people would bring a design thinking image and tell me, well, okay, here are the steps that we have to follow to make this cake. And I'd be like, but I know how to cook. In my mind, I would say that. And actually, so that's kind of where it started. Even before this book, I was trying to think about how can we work with both the people who need to understand the steps and the people who are comfortable enough to not even need a recipe. And that's when I started to think about these ingredients. But my work is focused more on social innovation than regular design process. So I started to move that analogy towards changing the world. What are the ingredients to changing the world? And so the cookbook was supposed to be, well, I was leaning into my positionality and I said it would have been the Afro-Caribbean Change the World cookbook or something like that. It had a ridiculously long title at first. And I had a lot of fun thinking about the book because I really leaned into that food analogy and said, well, okay, what are the recipes that I want to put into this recipe book? And so I thought, okay, recipe against, I don't know, sexism, another recipe against something else, and I created a list of recipes about things we wanted to change. And then eventually that started to morph into strategies for thriving while you're trying to change. And then the final book actually has 10 recipes. People mightn't identify them so clearly as recipes, but that's where it started, where it was like, okay, what are the 10 recipes that people need to go through to be better change makers, right? So if they start with the first recipe about understanding themselves and then go through all of them towards building equitable futures, it's like, and you practice those recipes over and over and over again to the point where you don't need them, automatically you will just be a better change maker. You'll be able to identify change better. You'll be able to build groups and teams around you. You'll be able to imagine new things and prototype and build new futures. So that was the idea behind the book.
What I like about that is that it's sort of anti-mechanistic. It's not a mechanism. We're not building a machine. We're building a soup. It's got lots of things in it and it's mixed together. And there's a way that you make a soup that might have some repeatable components to it, but we're not making a machine.
Yeah, the other thing I really liked about food is that, of course, we all eat food, right? And we can personalize that. Even though you might present a recipe for, I don't know, in Northern California, I can take that recipe and customize it to suit what I have here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And, so I found when I started to talk about design as cooking, I just was able to draw more people into the conversation because maybe I lost, in a good way, I lost some of the design jargon that I was using otherwise, or that we designers use otherwise. We make up our words and say, okay, let's brainstorm and ideate and, stuff like that. But people relate to food. And so that was a way that I was really trying to figure out how to make this understandable and then how to make this kind of easy. You try it out. If the bread doesn't taste that good, you make another one. It can sound flippant, but if we keep a little bit of that lightness in, that lightness gives us the energy to continue doing stuff, because you try this and it didn't work, and you tried something else and it was amazing. And then we'll try it again. And, and it's important for us to keep that rhythm because making change can be so stressful. Like if you are fighting racism, it is exhausting. I actually started off wanting to write a book that was a little bit more in the DEI space. That's a very, very tiring space to be in. When you know what I mean when I say that.
Mm-hmm.
And then this idea of being able to do a book that was more optimistic, more playful, that maybe could leave people feeling very powerful, that they could change the world. That was something that drove me in this process. And I was really, really happy when I sent a draft to my mother. And then my mother called me back and said, I'm going to bring together a group of young children and we're going to do something about it. I'm like, okay. Something happened there because she really did write me and say, okay, I'm ready to do some stuff. She doesn't have to do anything, but she said it left her feeling kind of energized and making her wanting to do something.
One of my friends, Joy Mountford, she's a designer. She was the head of user experience at Apple for a decade. What she said about IDEO, and she didn't say it quite as harsh as I'm going to say it. She said, IDEO's, yeah, it's a design company, but mostly it's a design jargon company. I thought was really funny. And what you're saying is that this is an antidote to that. Let's back off a little bit from the design jargon.
Yeah.
Let's use a
use
cooking
language
jargon that
everybody yes.
everybody understands. So I have a couple of closing questions that I always ask. The first one is odd and makes people think. What job do you hire your job to do for you?
What job do I hire my job to do? Which of my jobs? That's the thing. So, okay. I hire my job, which is university professor, to learn about the world. So, like, if I could have a university professor kind of whispering in my ear, maybe that's what Wikipedia is, right? Whispering in my ear, telling me about the world, that makes sense. A world that is accessible to me through their language, so I don't want overly university-eyed language, but I do want them to teach me about the world. I love being in the university space and I cross disciplines a lot. And I think it's the most exciting thing in the world to go into a new part of the university and listen to what people do there when they speak a language that we all understand. But when they're too much in there, tied up in their jargon, then no, I don't want that.
What does your job cost you?
I want my job to be free. I think education and knowledge should be free. There is a cost, of course, but I want my taxes, I want the global taxes, state taxes, whatever. I want someone to pay for it. But I do think that should be free. So I think it should not cost me anything other than my taxes.
Yeah. It was interesting to me when you spoke about the cost of writing a book. because to some extent, the cost of writing a book for you, if it was a book about DEI, it was more DEI centric, was the hardness of that space. I don't know where it would be on the emotion wheel.
Yes. And the hopelessness of thinking that actually you cannot change it.
Yeah. Where can people learn more about you? And where can people learn more about your book, which is Design Social Change? By the way, this is put out by the Stanford D School. And I learned about it from Susie Wise, who also has a book in that series, which is Design for Belonging. So where can people learn more about you?
I'm very easy to find. People can find me on social media. LinkedIn, Instagram are the best places for people to reach out to me, even if they don't know me. And I have a page as part of that D School book series. You mentioned Susie's book. Susie is an amazing person, and I'm happy to know her. But yeah, where do people find out about me? Really, LinkedIn and Instagram are the best places to find me. And then where can they find the book? As I said, there's a page at the D School, and then really all booksellers, the big name booksellers, small booksellers as well. And actually, people, fun fact, I read the audio for my book. So if people buy the audiobook, they'll get my interesting accent in the background and they'll hear me telling stories about the Caribbean.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Dad. This was fun.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.